Welcome, students, to another episode of History's Calling, Where Will It Take You? Today we have with us Dr. Matt Groh. Matt, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Matt, we were hoping we could get started by understanding who you are and what you do.
Great. Well, I'm a graduate of BYU. I did my undergraduate degree in history there. And right now I'm the managing director of the church history department.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I know that there are a lot of students that are very interested in what is happening over in the church history department. So we're really excited to talk with you a little bit about some of the projects that you might be doing today.
Great.
But maybe the first question is, I'd love for you to share with us, how did you get to where you are? What is your story?
Well, I've always loved history. Ever since I was in grade school, history was my passion, what I was most interested in. When I came to BYU and I was a freshman, my goal was to become a historian. I had a pretty clear idea of that's what I wanted to do, although I don't know that I really understood what that meant. And I had a great experience at BYU. After my undergraduate degree, I went to graduate school at the University of Notre Dame to study American religious history, get a master's and a PhD. It is a great place to study the history of religion. And from there, spent a couple of years as a postdoctorate scholar at Notre Dame, and then I got a teaching job at the University of Southern Indiana. When you're in graduate school, you just apply for lots and lots of teaching jobs to lots and lots of universities and colleges you've never heard of. And so I spent about 2.5 years in Evansville, Indiana, had a really great experience there, and then was recruited to come join the church history department in Salt Lake. And it's an opportunity to pursue a topic I was really passionate about, opportunity to move back closer to family and some things like that. And for about the past 10 years, I've worked for the church history department. For most of that time, I worked mostly with our publications. So I was director of what we call our publications division. So that was mostly when I joined the Joseph Smith papers. And we expanded over time to start a number of women's history initiatives, and then to begin writing the 4-volume history of the church that's called Saints, the Story of the Church of Jesus Christ in the Latter Days. And about a couple of years ago, I became the managing director of the department, which means that I help do the administration for the entire department. And we run the museum in downtown Salt Lake City, the Church History Museum. We run the historic sites of the church. So from the Joseph Smith birthplace in Vermont to the Mormon Battalion Center in San Diego and Nauvoo and Kirtland and all the things in between. We run the Church History Library, which is in downtown Salt Lake. So we have a very active program of acquiring records. We try to capture records that reflect the experience of church members around the globe. And we also capture all the administrative records of the church. Then, of course, we're charged to preserve those records over time. And so we also do a lot of conservation and preservation work, both with the church's records, but also with its buildings.
That's amazing. I hear you're actually wrapping up the Joseph Smith paper project, correct? Within the next year or so. So that's amazing that you're diving into some other projects currently. That it seems like an exciting time over there in your office.
Yeah, the Joseph Smith Papers is a great project. It really gets us started at BYU, then moves up to the church history department, probably about 15 years ago now. And it is exciting. Our final volume will be published in 2 years from this spring. And I think the church has seen a lot of benefits from the Joseph Smith Papers, and there's a desire to continue an active publishing program at church headquarters. And so to be able to expand that to do more in women's history, to do more in the global history of the church, and then to do, the Joseph Smith Papers is a very academic project. And so that's part of what we do. Things very much focused on scholarship and scholars. But then part of our mandate, and probably the most important part of our mandate, is to speak to what we call public history, right? To speak to the broad audience of people out there interested in history, and particularly in our case, the members of the church, which means both very educated people in Provo, and it means new converts in Nigeria and Brazil and Australia and everywhere else. So so that's what we're trying to do with the Saints Project, to speak to the church on a broad scale.
That's amazing. It's such an honor to have you speak to these things and all of the work that you've done to make that possible. I'm curious to know, it sounds to me like, do you get to do as much research as you have in the past? It sounds like you've moved into a space where you're thinking about strategy, and you're thinking about how do we make sure that the publications are right for varying groups of people. Are there things about this job that you didn't anticipate that you would do, but that excite you?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I mean, when I went into history in graduate school, my first love was always researching and writing, and of course, as a professor, particularly at the type of university I was at, your first assignment is to teach, right? That's what that's what you're there to do. And so you're able to research and write as part of your responsibilities. And when I came to the church history department, I was partly in an administrative job, which was something I'd never done before, but also partly in a job that involved a lot of researching and writing and editing. And in my current role, it's the research and writing. I'm more reviewing what other people have done and trying to contribute in that way. A little bit of research and writing on my own, but mostly it's like you're saying. Mostly it's thinking about how do we best reach the audiences we're trying to reach. What do our historic sites need to be doing? How do we best preserve? How do we capture, like this last year? How do we capture the history of the church going through the pandemic? What are the records we need to be gathering right now? What are the oral histories we need to be doing? How do we capture these records so that the historians in 40 and 50 and 200 years have the records they need?
That's amazing. I have not thought about creating what we're doing to create history now. How are we preserving? We talk a lot about that, I think, as Latter-day Saints, but we don't necessarily think about what does it look like to preserve accurate timelines, information, etc. That's incredible. That's incredible.
And we're a very unique religion and institution when it comes to how conscious we are about history. We often talk about how it's in a revelation on the day the church is organized, that the Lord declares, "Behold, the record shall be kept among you." And the church has a historian appointed very, very early on. Oliver Cowdery's a historian, and then John Whitmer and some of these very early saints. We've always have had historians since then. We've always been record keepers. We've always been thinking about how do we tell our story, how do we collect records. And so it's great to be part of that tradition, to be part of a religion that takes history so seriously.
I love that. Thank you so much for that. So I want to rewind a little bit, because I feel like I could probably talk about your projects all day long. I'm very fascinated. But I'm curious to know what kind of advice that you have for students about the things that you wish you would have known maybe going into graduate. Did you always know that you would end up doing religious history for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? And then kind of what did that look like, and how did that play out for you in grad school?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was always really interested in the history of the saints, right, in church history. And I thought that would always be part of what I did for my career. But of course, you don't go to graduate school to end up at the church history department. I went to graduate school with the primary intention that I would be a college professor somewhere. And so my primary job would always be to teach American history, to teach the history of religion. And Latter-day Saints is a small part of that story. But so I think that would be my first piece of advice. Going to graduate school, you have to think broadly, and of course you're going to have a specific interest, but most of your teaching is not going to be in that specific interest. Most of your public history work will be maybe related to that interest that you're researching, but you always have to be able to think more broadly, put things in context. And for me, I always kind of envisioned two possible pathways. The two of the great historians of Latter-day Saint history of kind of the past generation were Leonard Arrington and Richard Bushman. And Richard Bushman made his career in the academy. He was always a professor, but yet he wrote on church history and was enormously influential. And that was sort of the path I thought I would take. I'll get a teaching job. I'll write on the history of the church because that's what I love. Leonard Arrington, of course, he was a very successful college professor as well, but then he was asked to come to church headquarters and work there and work for the church, which is a very different set of priorities, a very different set of responsibilities. And I thought I would probably try to follow the Richard Bushman model, not the Leonard Arrington model, but I ended up with the Leonard Arrington model. So that's maybe the other piece of advice, is just to be open to where your path takes you. You probably aren't going to know from the beginning. You're probably not going to know when you go, if you do go to graduate school, what you're totally going to specialize in. So be open to the possibilities. At an undergraduate level, take a wide array of history classes, figure out what most interests you, and do that at the graduate level, and be open to different kinds of employment. I mean, it's no secret that it's hard to get a job with a graduate degree in history if what you're thinking about is, I want to teach at a university. So of course, as an undergraduate, you have these great models of these history professors, and the fact of the matter is that the type of job they have at BYU is really sort of at the top of the history profession for people who want to do that kind of work. They've got a great sort of balance of teaching and research. They're sort of the ones who have made it to the peak of their profession in that way. And most people who get history PhDs don't end up with teaching jobs at research universities where they have relatively small classes, and they have research assistants to help them, and they have teaching assistants to help. Most people don't end up with those kind of jobs. So I think going into it, you need to be realistic about that and open to the options. I mean, I didn't think I would love doing public history as much as I do, but it's become clear to me that this was the right path for me, even though most of my cohort in graduate school, we would have thought, that guy didn't make it. He went into public history. You kind of have that sort of sensibility at times.
So it's interesting. Earlier, you talked about where you ended up teaching, and you said at that point, after your graduate studies were complete, you applied. You said something kind of these, not no-name schools, right? But kind of these schools that not very many people knew about, or
Sure.
New opportunities existed. Can you maybe speak to that a little bit? What advice would you have for somebody who really does want the kind of thing, the ideal job, right? Working as a history professor in a research university. What advice do you have?
Well, and that's a great job. I mean, it really is a great job for people who love history, who love to teach, who love to write, who love to research. It's a great job. One of the downsides of that job is you're probably not going to have, you can't pick where you live. And so the year I was finishing my dissertation, I went on the job market, which means you look at the different places the jobs are advertised. You find anything that sort of fits what you do, and maybe it's 50 jobs and maybe it's 80. You send out a cover letter and you send out a CV. And that year, I think I got one job interview. And that was at BYU. And that's because at BYU, I'm not one of 200 applicants. You have to be a Latter-day Saint to teach at BYU. So I'm probably one of 20 or 30 qualified applicants. Still not great odds. I didn't get that job. And then I had a postdoc at Notre Dame. And the next year I applied to the same number of jobs. And I had a couple of preliminary interviews, and that was it. Fortunately, my postdoc was a 2-year postdoc. And I was able to get a book contract for my dissertation. I was a little bit further on. I had more teaching experience. So my third year on the job market, I had a number of preliminary interviews and advanced in some of the searches and got a job offer at a college in Southern Indiana, the University of Southern Indiana, and of course, so I probably applied to 200 colleges along the way, and yeah, and you just I think your strategy has to be you're willing to go wherever, and you're not going to start at a research university, most likely. Some people do, but most people don't. And so you just have to know going in that you don't have a lot of pick over where you choose. Evansville, Indiana wouldn't have been top of my list. Of course, I've been in South Bend, Indiana, which is on the opposite side of the state. But it was a great place to be, and I think maybe a related piece of advice is you just always dive into to where you're at and learn the place and learn the culture and get to know the students and your colleagues and make the best of it.
Absolutely, and it sounds like it prepared you for what you're doing now. So it wasn't like it was this opportunity that came because you needed a job. It was the opportunity that was necessary for you to get to where you are. That's what I'm hearing, at least.
Yeah, I mean, I yeah, definitely help prepare for the next step.
Awesome. So I wanted to talk with you a little bit about I know we're going backwards in time a long time, but in your undergrad experience in history, how did that contribute to the work you're doing now? So if you could give advice to students about if you want to do something like I'm doing, here were the things that I did, or here were the things that I wish I would have done to be prepared.
Yeah, so I think the first thing I try to do is to take a wide variety of the upper level courses, and to get a sense of the different eras of history, the different approaches to history. I think the second thing I tried to do, which was important to me, is to seek out mentors in the history department and in other departments. And as part of that, I tried to get teaching assistant positions and research assistant positions. So I think 3 of the years I was at BYU, I was working for professors, and that was just so critical for me, you know. And one of the first jobs I had was for a professor of Latin American history, and I served a mission to Brazil, so you know I knew a little bit of the languages. But you know, he just had me doing all sorts of tasks to help with his publications, and kind of taught me, oh, this is what someone does when they're writing an encyclopedia article, and this is what someone does when he's working on his book chapter. And then also opportunities to be a teaching assistant. And for my own kind of field of Latter-day Saint history, at that time, BYU had a center called the Joseph Fielding Smith Institute for LDS History. And I went and applied there, and was able to get some research assistant jobs. So I was working in the field that really became important to me. And the mentors open doors. It's just so much of life is about creating relationships with people, building those relationships, and then those people are invested in you. And so one of the things that the Joseph Fielding Smith Institute did at the time was they brought in Richard Bushman to teach summer seminars to graduate students. And Richard was writing Rough Stone Rolling, which is his biography of Joseph Smith. And he had a sense of mission that he wanted to mentor graduate students, and he also wanted to get research done for Rough Stone Rolling. So there were a couple motivations here. And the year I finished my undergraduate work at BYU, I really wanted to get into that seminar, and mostly he was taking more advanced graduate students. But you know, I'd worked for a professor named Noel Reynolds, and Noel and Richard were old friends, and Richard really respected Noel, and Noel said, you know, you should really consider Matt, and he helped open that door, help get me into that seminar, which was really crucial. And so one mentor helps lead to opportunities, leads to more mentors, and so you know, you kind of have to just try to try to put yourself out there in a sense, get to know your professors. And I was quite introverted as a student. It was difficult for me to talk in class. I remember when I started at Notre Dame, I was pretty intimidated by a lot of the kids in the classes. A lot of them had master's degrees. I did not. They had master's degrees from Harvard, and at least like, what am I doing? Like, and so, and the classes last for like 2.5 hours, and it's all discussion based. And it was really difficult for me to kind of really begin participating. And so I actually had this goal. I have to say 2 things in this class over the next 2 hours, and other people are, they're talking up a storm. I'm like, no, I have to insert myself into the discussion. And so everyone's going to have their different strategies for how they go about inserting themselves in discussions and getting to know people and building those relationships. I do think that's really crucial. The other thing I did at BYU, which helped me a lot, was at the time, maybe this still exists, there was a student journal called the Thadian. So I worked on the Thadian for a couple of years, checked people's footnotes and ran down references and tried to do some editing. And that's a lot of what I do now is editing work. And so that was important, but it also helped teach me about the publishing process, and it helped encourage me as a senior to take my senior research paper really seriously and to try to get it into a place where I could present it at the student conference at BYU. And then I presented it at the Mormon History Association meetings. And the secret is a lot of the academic associations love to have student participation. So I was accepted on the program, was able to give this paper, and then was able to use it for graduate school applications and eventually get it published. So for me, where I loved research and writing, it was to look for the opportunities. Can I get involved with the professor? Can I get involved with the student journal? Can I maybe even try to do something along those lines myself?
I love that, because one of the things that we talk about here in our advising offices, in order to prepare students, whether or not they decide to go on to graduate studies or not, is the value of experiential learning. And it sounds to me like your entire undergrad experience was just vibrant that way, in that you inserted yourself into research assisting programs and publication and things that really qualified you for that next step. And I think that that's so valuable for students to understand, and that it was years worth. It wasn't you waited until your junior, senior year. You were involved from the beginning. As hard and as difficult as it sounds like maybe that was for you, kind of admitting that you were introverted in this experience. So. Right.
No, I think that is really important to begin early looking for those opportunities, to be trying to do things as a sophomore and as a junior to build those relationships. If you're interested in graduate school, you do have to be thinking about, how do I build my resume? How do I build the case that a graduate school should take me, and should not only take me, but should pay for me, right? Because in general, it's not a great idea to take on debt to get a history graduate degree, right? So you want to think carefully about the programs and the finances and things like that. And in the position I'm in now, we do a lot of hiring, and I do think those experiential learning is really important. And so we hire people like myself, who have gone and gotten a PhD and are going to work on the Joe Smith papers and are going to do hardcore academic work. We also hire writers who have a history consciousness, but know how to communicate really, really well. We hire people who are really interested in conservation. So people who work with our old books and manuscripts and have been to a conservation program or been to a rare book school to know how to do that sort of work. We hire lots of people with master's degrees in history, with lots of people with master's degrees in library science. So all in all, we've got about 250 people in our department. And so we're hiring every year. And some of those, of course, are, is administrative staff, and some of it's is people who help digitize the collection. So they're working with a scanner or a camera all day long to digitize records. And then we also hire people who have gone to school to learn about how do you conserve a building, how do you be a museum curator, how do you do oral histories really well, and of course with the church becoming more and more global, language is really important. And so a lot of people have that from their mission, but to really communicate at the level that you need to communicate at, it can't just be your mission, right? You get back to BYU and you take those additional 3 years in Spanish to where you're really good, and then we're interested in you, because there's lots of people who speak mission Spanish, and we don't want to have you do an oral history in Costa Rica with your mission Spanish. You've got to be excellent.
It's interesting that you said that, because one of the things that I wrote down here that I wanted to talk to you about was this idea of localization and translation, and how important that is in the work that you do. It sounds to me like that's becoming, as you're moving to global history for the church, that's something that we will see a lot more of. Is that accurate?
Yeah, no, I think in all aspects of what the church is doing, that's kind of the great question, right? How do you globalize? How do you localize at the same time, right? I mean, there's a lot of interest in material not just coming from church headquarters, but material produced in area offices. The church, of course, is divided into administrative units that we call areas, and each area has an area presidency. So there's an area in Brazil, and there's an area in the Pacific, and there's an area in Europe, and 3 in Africa, and there is a great interest in how do we tell history that captures the experience of the local saints in a way that's just not a top-down headquarters sort of history. And so the last some of the hiring that we've done the last couple of years is we've hired 6 or 7 people that work in those area offices, and we're not sending people from the United States to do that. We're hiring locally, excellent people, not all with backgrounds in history, but many. But who love history, who know how to do things, who know how to get things done. And they're in charge of collecting records locally. So we have a really extensive oral history program where we want to capture the experience of Latter-day Saints around the globe. And it's much better for our employee in Ghana to do that than it would be for us to send a team to do that, or much better for our employee in Mexico City to be able to do that, and so on and so forth. And so I think thinking about the church and the church history department, the more globally trained and conscious and skilled that a person is, the more we're going to be interested in them. I mean, we'll probably continue to hire people like me who were trained in 19th century American religious history. We're always going to need an expertise in the church's origins, but I think our great need is to how do we hire great people who can work with people around the globe collaboratively to do that. I get the other thing I'd mention about, I think, a lot of public history institutions that's different than purely academic jobs. I'll mention 2 differences. One is how collaborative the work is. So we are always working in teams, and you kind of have a sense that the lone professor writing his great book. That's true. A lot of academics, of course, a lot of academics work collaboratively as well. But we're intensely collaborative. So the Saints team, it's creative writers working with historians all day long, working with editors, working with source checkers. On the Joe Smith papers, it's a team of historians working with editors all day long to do that. work. And the same thing is true of our historic sites program and everything else we do. We work collaboratively. The other, I think, difference in general, and one of the things that really attracted me to work for the church is that the things that we do from the church have a visibility, have an expanded voice. And there's a trade-off there, right? I don't go to work every day and I say, what would I like to think about today? No, right? And we don't hire people and say, what do you want to write about? Which of course is part of the freedom that people work really hard in graduate school to have as a professor, right? The freedom to pursue your intellectual curiosity, to pursue subjects that are important to you. So that's one of the trade-offs, because we don't hire people and say, what would you like to work on? We hire people and we say, we'd like you to work on documents, volume 14 of our document series in the Joe Smith papers, or we'd like you to work on this historic site. And of course, we do encourage our people to do some writing on the side and things like that. But the primary responsibility is always going to be what has the department, in collaboration with church leaders, determined that our projects should be. But the gain that you get from that is that we're able to speak with a megaphone. So you're able to participate in projects like, take volume 1 of Saints. The first book I wrote, my PhD dissertation was a biography of a guy named Thomas Caine, who was not a Latter-day Saint, but really helped the Latter-day Saints in the 19th century. He's also a Civil War general, and there was other interesting things about him. And I think they printed 1,000 copies of that book, and I was really excited. And every year I get a little notice from the press, and it says you sold 3 more books this year. Of course, it's been a while. The first year you sell a few more than that, but then you take like Saints Volume 1. It's hard to tell exactly how many people have read that book, because it's an audiobook and it's an ebook and you read it online and then you sell print copies. But probably more than 2 million people have read Saints Volume 1. So it's just a different scale, right? Because with the church, you have all the church channels, and you have the trust that members have in the church, and you have an audience that's hungry for this sort of material, and it trusts it coming from the church and is aware of it because the church does things to make them aware of it. So from a public history institution like the church history department, often you're able to work on products with a reach that is just that's often many times more than you could as a traditional academic. Now, the other trade-off I would say as a traditional academic is that as an academic, I think you can have deeper influence on individual students, right? So as an academic, you have these relationships with students, and you're teaching students, and you can really, I think, help shape and mold and provide counsel and advice. And I think people are shaped by reading Saints, but that's a different type of depth of influence. And so there's just kind of various things to think about in terms of academic or public history. But I would just say keep the public history options on the table, even as you pursue, even if you think you're pursuing a more traditional academic path.
I like that. One of the things that I ask a lot of my students when they're choosing between different avenues to consider is, what are you saying yes to and what are you saying no to? And so I really like the idea that influence is a part of this work, regardless of where the impact is happening. So you get to decide where you want that impact to happen. Do you want it on this larger scale? Do you want it this in-depth mentoring, teaching experience? So I really like that you brought up that that's something to keep in mind as students and undergrads are considering what they want to do with their degrees. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I just have one more question for you. You talked a lot about your ability to hire multiple people, especially as you're expanding kind of the strategy for what histories can do for the church. I'm curious to know, I know that we've done internships with you in the past. How can our students prepare to maybe be a part of those experiences with you?
Yeah, so we do a couple different types of internships with BYU students and with other students. The first is internships for academic credit, right, where you come up as kind of a replacement for a class and you work on the Joseph Smith papers or something else. And we have a kind of an application process that people go through. The other type would be kind of a full-time intern. And generally that's people who have finished their degree but are interested in pursuing history, but they're not sure what path. And oftentimes people do this for a year or two and then go on to graduate school. And we do internships in historic sites and in our publications and in our library. So there are a variety of options, but yeah, don't hesitate to look into internship possibilities with the church history department. And if we need to do a better job of publicizing those, Lindsay, we'd be happy to work with you on that.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, just as we were wrapping up here, is there anything else that I feel like I've just been so enlightened by a lot of the conversation today and the passion that you have in all these things that are happening for the church? Is there anything else that you feel that students need to know as they consider either opportunities for the church or just opportunities in history in general?
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit torn by the advice, because sometimes I think for people who want to pursue a PhD in history, I tell them, don't do this unless it's the only thing that you want to do, because it's a long path and it's with uncertain outcomes. And if you're going to be just as happy doing something else, maybe take a more secure path. A history graduate student path, you're going to be poor for a long time, and you're going to be, so there's those economic trade-offs as well. But I would temper that advice by saying I think there are lots of opportunities in history, and I think public history and thinking about public history. Thinking about museums and thinking about historic sites and thinking about libraries and thinking about how can I be in the field of history. I think there's lots of opportunities, and just to be thoughtful and explore those as you go along, I think would be my advice.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Groh, thank you so much for being here with us. We really appreciate your time. I'm excited for all the work that you're doing. I am a recipient of a lot of those publications that you've talked about today and have been very entrenched in it. And the work that you're doing is really incredible. And thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's generally easy to talk about yourself, so.
Isn't that the truth?